Hello guys, I'm Tivanny Meilina and welcome back to my YouTube channel. And yesterday we was talking about Edwardian era and now we will talking about Modernism era. Modernism in the fine arts, a break with the past and the concerned search for new forms of expressions. Modernism fostered a period of experimentation in the arts from the late 19th to the middle 20th century, particularly in the years following World War I. The modernist impulse is fueled in various literatures by industrialization and urbanization and by the search for an authentic response to a much changed world. Although pre-war works by Henry James, Joseph Conrad, and other writers are considered modernists, modernism as a literary movement is typically associated with the period after World War I. The enormity of the war had undermined humankind's faith in the foundations of Western society and culture, and post-war modernist literature reflected a sense of disillusionment and fragmentation. The publication of the Irish writer James Joyce's Ulysses in 1922 was a landmark event in the development of modernist literature. Densely lengthy and controversial, the novel details the events of one day in the life of three Dubliners through a technique known as stream of consciousness, which commonly ignores orderly sentence structure and incorporates fragments of thought in an attempt to capture the flow of characters' mental process. Portions of the book were considered absent, and Ulysses was banned for many years in English-speaking countries. Other Europe and American modernist authors whose works rejected chronological and narrative continuity include Virginia Woolf, Marcel Proust, Gertrude Stein, and William Faulkner. Classic works of modernist literature. First, Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness. First published in three installments in Blackwood's magazine in 1899 and then in book form in 1902. Heart of Darkness thus straddles the Victorian and modern eras. It first appeared when Victoria was still on the throne, but by the time the book version was published, Britain had a new monarch and was firmly in a new century. And the second, T.S. Eliot, The Waste Land. This 1922 long poem features as it must in our pick of Eliot's best poems, and it's one of the landmark works of modernist literature, perhaps the most important poem in all of modernism. In the poem, T.S. Eliot draws on personal experience, his first marriage, his knowledge of London, his convalescence following some sort of nervous breakdown, but transmutes it into something universal and in his word, impersonal, a poem that spoke for an entire generation. Third, D.H. Lawrence, Tickets Please, written during World War I and focusing on the men and women who work on the trams in Nottingham. Ticket Please examines the shifting gender roles in the early 20th century and the latent desires and impulse which Freudian psychoanalysis had lain bare. Fourth, James Joyce Ulysses, published in the Annus Mirabilis of Modernism 1922, Ulysses is Joyce's masterpiece. It's also one of the best modernist novels ever written. The novel is a retelling of Homer's epic poem The Odyssey, about Greek hero Odysseus returned home from the Trojan Wars, a journey which took him 10 years but which Joyce condenses to a single day in Dublin, 16 June 1904. The main characteristics of modernist literature. Individualism. In modernist literature, the individual is more interesting than society. Specifically, modernist writers were fascinated with how the individual adapted to the changing world. In some cases, the individual triumphed over obstacles. For the most part, modernist literature featured characters who just kept their heads above water, Writers presented the world or society as a challenge to the integrity of their characters. Ernest Hemingway is especially remembered for vivid characters who accepted their circumstances at face value and persevered. Experimentation. Modernist writers broke free of old forms and technique. Poets abandoned traditional rhymes, schemes, and wrote in free verse. Novelists defied all expectation. Writers mix image from the past with modern language and dance, creating a college of styles. The inner workings of consciousness were a common subject for modernists. This preoccupation led to a form of narration called stream of consciousness, where the point of view of the novel meanders in a pattern resembling human thought. Authors James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, along with poets T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, are well known for their experimental modernist work. Absurdity. The carnage of two world wars profoundly affected writers of the period. Several great English poets died or were wounded in World War I. At the same time, global capitalism was reorganizing society at every level. For many writers, the world was becoming a more absurd place every day. The mysteriousness of life was being lost in the rush of daily life. The senseless violence of World War II was yet more evidence that humanity had lost its way. Modernist authors depicted this absurdity in their works. Franz Kafka is the metamorphosis in which a traveling salesman is transformed into an insect-like creature is an example of modern absurdism. Symbolism. The modernist writers infuse objects, people, place, and events with significant meanings. They imagine a reality with multiple layers, many of them hidden or in a sort of code. The idea of a poem as a riddle to be cracked had its beginnings in the modernist period. Symbolism was not a new concept in literature, but the modernist particular use of symbols was an innovation. They left much more to the reader imagination than earlier writers, leading to open-ended narratives with multiple interpretations. For example, James Joyce's Ulysses incorporates distinctive, open-ended symbol in each chapter. Formalism. Writers of the modernist period saw literature most as a craft than a flowering of creativity. They believed that poems and novels were constructed from smaller parts instead of the organic internal process that earlier generation had described. The idea of literature as craft fed the modernist desire for creativity and originality. Modernist poetry often includes foreign language, dense vocabulary, and invented words. The poet Cummings abandoned all structure and spread his words all across the page.